Hello, my name is Tate Boyer, and I am presenting on major or mild cognitive disorders due to traumatic brain injury. In the DSM, the diagnostic criteria, first of all, stipulates that the disorder must meet the criteria for major or mild neurocognitive disorder. But that is specified to be in criteria C, that it must be immediately following a traumatic brain injury and lasting longer than the recovery time for those injuries. There must also be evidence of traumatic brain injury. There are specific symptoms of traumatic brain injury that the DSM-5 stipulates, including loss of consciousness, amnesia, confusion, disorientation, as well as neurological signs. These neurological signs can be medical imaging, such as a CT scan or an MRI. But they could also be new or worsening seizures. New seizures if you haven't had seizures before, but if you had a worsening of those seizure symptoms. Hypanopsia, which is a loss of your range of field of vision. So essentially, on the sides of your vision, it may be blurry, you're not able to make out objects, and it reduces your field of vision. Hemiparesis, which is paralysis or weakening on one side of your body. And anosmia, which is the loss of the sense of smell. So, to understand this diagnosis, we need to really gain an understanding of traumatic brain injury. Now, traumatic brain injuries are caused by impacts to the head, but they can also be an explosion, a concussive blast that causes the brain to move very suddenly. And what happens is the brain inside of the skull hits one edge of the skull, and then when it stops, your head stops moving, it hits the other side of the skull. This can cause damage, especially with concussive blast. This can cause damage to the brain because the brain is essentially floating in your skull in fluid, and it will keep moving when your head moves very suddenly. Mild traumatic brain injuries are also known as concussions, but more severe traumatic brain injuries can include brain contusions, bruising and swelling, intracranial hemorrhage, which is bleeding in the brain, which is very, very serious, and possible objects penetrating the skull and brain. Causes of TBI, the number one cause of a traumatic brain injury is falls. It accounts for the largest portion of traumatic brain injuries, as followed by motor vehicle accidents, and beyond that is sports injuries. Now, sports injuries is very interesting because pretty much any sport can, if something happens that causes an injury, can cause a concussion. But two sports in particular have a history of repeated concussions, and those are football and boxing. And specifically with football, there's actually a great movie called Concussion with Will Smith, where he plays a doctor who investigated the repeated concussions sustained by football players and what that does neurologically to them. It's a very good movie. I highly suggest you read it, or that you watch it. But even beyond that, boxing, which, interestingly, if you've never seen the Rocky series actually does get into the repeated concussions sustained from boxing. Rocky with Sylvester Stallone actually does a fairly good job of looking at the effects of repeatedly subjecting your body to that level of punishment. And then, of course, there are military combat injuries, and this is where explosive concussive blasts do cause not all major military combat injuries, but quite a few traumatic brain injuries. Symptoms of traumatic brain injuries. There are emotional symptoms, irritability, increased frustration, tension, anxiety, increased depression, increased risk for depression, mood swings. I'm going to be getting further into the increased risk for depression in the next slide, with the increased risk for suicide. But personality, here's the other very interesting thing about TBI, and especially with repeated traumatic brain injuries, like we see with football players and boxers, is we can actually see personality change, or even just one traumatic brain injury that is significant enough, we can see personality change. The personality of the person can actually change. Disinhibition, apathy, suspicion, aggression. Aggression is a big one. And you can actually see how with football players who have had repeated traumatic brain injuries, they can become more aggressive and actually see increased rates of domestic violence as well. Physical symptoms, headaches, fatigue, sleep disorders, ringing in the ears, sensitivity to light, loss of smell, like we discussed in the criteria. And then there are those neurological symptoms that are in the criteria as well. So quick note on traumatic brain injury and suicide. The CDC, using data from the National Vital Statistics System from 2000 to 2017, actually showed that suicide was the leading cause of traumatic brain injury related deaths from 2009 to 2011, and again in 2015 to 2017. Those other times it had been motor vehicle crashes, but suicide is actually a huge risk with traumatic brain injury that we as clinicians need to look out for, because the risk of suicide is doubled. So there's a very good article from the CDC on this. Thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the presentation.